Hi, I'm Ray from the Radio Workshop, where I repair and restore vintage valve radios from the 1940s. My amateur radio call sign is Golf 4 November Sierra Juliet. Welcome to yet another podcast. I met Kirsty in a pub, as you do. She was waiting to be served at the bar, and I was standing next to her, and she mumbled, "The audio on that jukebox is dreadful." Now I think she was thinking aloud rather than talking to me. So I just looked at her and I said, "Yes, I agree, I think it's distorted." And then she surprised me. She said, "Probably a transistor amplifier instead of a decent valve amp." Now that's not the sort of thing you normally hear from anyone in a pub, let alone a girl, very attractive girl, blonde, slim, very, very attractive, early 20s. And I was surprised that she was talking about valve amps. I asked her what she knew about amps, transistor amps, valve amps. And she said, I know quite a lot about audio gear because I've got my own studio. That's when my interest, I was already interested in her, but that's when my interest peaked. I said, your own studio? Well, what do? You record stuff? You recording studio? What is it? She seemed a little cagey, as if she didn't want to say too much. She suggested that we go and sit in a corner. There was a table in a quiet corner of the pub. We sat there and I asked her again about the recording studio. Was she a singer? Did she play instruments? What was it all about? She didn't seem to want to talk about it. That was fair enough, so I didn't push it. She did say that she hadn't got a great deal of time. She'd only popped out for cigarettes. Most people smoked in those days, as I did, and she'd just popped out for a packet of cigarettes. Thought she'd have a swift vodka and lime, as it was in those days. Do you remember vodka and lime? Very popular drink. We got chatting. I bought her another drink. I had another beer. And I asked her a little bit more. I sort of ventured into the studio area again. And she said, "Look, do you want to come back to my place? It's only around the corner. I'll show you my studio." Of course, I jumped at the opportunity not only to see her studio, but to go back to her place with her. I'd walked to the pub because I only lived round the corner, and it turned out that she lived round the corner as well, so we weren't far from each other. She lived in a flat. It was an old house, a very big house that had been converted into flats, luxury flats by the look of it, really nice property. I followed her in, quite a spacious hallway, nice lounge, well-fitted kitchen, and I followed her down the hall, past the bedroom door. I looked in there and she said, "No, we're not going in there," so I laughed at that. She said, "This is the room I want you to see." She opened the door, put this light on, like low lighting in there. It was really nice, well lit, but low lighting. And there was this studio. The walls were lined with shelves, which were full of records, 45s plus LPs, absolutely floor to ceiling, jam-packed with records. And as she pointed out, that was good for the acoustics. It was like, it absorbed all the echoes and things like that, because all the records were in their sleeves, of course. There were two beautiful record decks. They were professional decks. Now my friends and I, we had Garrard SP25 decks, and we thought they were really cool. But this Kirsty, she had two, BBC quality type decks. They were professional record decks. I forget the make of them, but she did say they were the type the BBC used. And two Ferrograph tape recorders. They looked brand new. They were hugely expensive in those days. Was it Series 5? Series 6? I can't remember. You know, the iconic Ferrograph tape recorders, two of those. There was electronic keyboard, beautiful electronic keyboard, and she said she could play that. She made her own jingles, apparently. So I'm asking her questions. What's all this about? All this money this must have cost you. What is going on here? I assumed at that stage that she was some kind of professional DJ. Again, she seemed a bit cagey. She chose a record, put on an LP, which was rather good. Jimi Hendrix, which I rather liked. She put that on. Monitor speakers there were beautiful. I forget again what make they were, but it was all professional stuff. There were no BSR record decks or tape decks. That's what I used at home, as a clapped out old BSR tape deck. So looking at these two Ferrograph machines I was in awe. Absolutely fantastic. So she put on this Hendrix. I think it was, it was Electric Ladyland. And she went to the kitchen. She came back with a beer for me and whatever it was she had. More vodka, I think. And she just didn't want to really tell me what it was about. I was saying, well, what do you do here? You sit in the swivel chair, obviously, a professional microphone. Again, BBC quality type microphone there. Fantastic gear. And she said, oh, I just sort of play around. Well, I didn't believe that, because you don't spend what must have been, even back in those days, hundreds and hundreds of pounds on professional equipment just to play around. She obviously had money. I gathered that much. She had money, but I couldn't find out anything. I didn't know what she did for work, what job she did. I had in the pub, I said, what do you do for a living? She just said this and that. So that didn't really answer my question. She was mysterious. I think that's one of the things that I liked about, well, I like many things about her, but she was mysterious, and I like that. Not so much the cagey side of her, but there was something mysterious about her, looking into her blue eyes. I don't know, I was trying to read something there, but I couldn't. I didn't know what she was all about. She brought another chair in for me. She sat in her swivel chair, and we just both sat there sipping our drinks, listening to a bit of Hendrix. And I didn't like to ask too many questions. I don't know why. I felt I was prying, because it was obvious she didn't want to say too much. But she did start to open up, and she said that she was a DJ for a radio station. Now, in those days, obviously there was no internet, there was no streaming, there was no sign of a transmitter, and there wouldn't be a radio station at her house, well, unless it was a pirate radio station, which at that stage I hadn't even thought about. So she said, no, she said, I make up the tapes, hence the ferrograph machines. She said, I do my show, I make up the tapes, I send them off to London. I'm then saying, well, what station is it? What's the station called? Do I know it? Is it the BBC? And she said, no, I won't have heard of it, and left it at that. Again, mysterious. After a couple more drinks, she said, look, don't tell anyone about the studio. She said, don't tell your friends or anything, all about this. I don't want people to know. She said, I only brought you back here, she said, because you showed a real interest and you seemed to be on my wavelength, which we did get on together. We were on the same wavelength. Sorry, excuse the pun, radio station wavelength. But we were getting on really well together. So I said, no, fair enough, I won't tell anyone. I mean, I hadn't thought of telling anyone anyway, but it was at that stage when I thought, well, this might be pirate radio. She's sending the tapes off to London. It might be pirate radio, which was something I'd always been interested in. And I did say to her, to try and broach the subject, I said, I set up a recording studio a few years ago, and I built a little transmitter, pirated on medium wave, did a bit of music. So that's as close as I've ever got to being a professional DJ. I laughed and she laughed. She said, oh, pirate radio. She said, yeah, there are quite a few pirate stations in London. And I said, yes, I've heard on FM, because we were all medium wave down here, all us pirates down on the coast. But up in London it was all FM, because they could use tower blocks and all sorts of things. And the aerial was just a dipole, of course. She actually mentioned Band 2. Now, Band 2 is the VHF FM band. Now, not many people refer to it as Band 2, so she was obviously very much in the know, not just about audio, but about radio in general. I finally finished my beer and thought it was time to go. I didn't want to outstay my welcome, bearing in mind we'd only just met that evening. And she said, what are you doing Wednesday? So I said, nothing. Well, Wednesday evening, nothing. She said, come round at 7, you can watch me do my hour-long radio show. So I thought that was brilliant. So yeah, I'll be here at 7. I was quite excited about Wednesday, and I met a couple of my mates during the week. I didn't say anything. I wanted to say I've met this girl and she's got this professional recording studio, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't. She had asked me not to mention it. I took a carrier bag round there with some beers, some cold beers from my fridge. I didn't want to keep drinking hers. The chair was in the studio next to her swivel chair. I sat there with my beer, and she turned all the gear on and started to do her hour-long show. Now, she was known, as I discovered, as the girl. Her name was Kirsty, she used that name, and she was known as the girl. And she had made up a little jingle, which was absolutely brilliant. Do you know the record? You remember the Beatles, Girl? I won't sing it to you. Girl. Sorry, no, don't switch off. I won't sing again. And she had somehow, I don't know what she'd done, she'd somehow sort of manipulated this little snippet of music, and it sounded like rather than a girl, the girl. And that was her sort of little introductory type jingle. And she was saying, "You're listening to the girl, it's midnight." Now what she had done is set the clock, it was 8 o'clock I think she started. She'd set the clock to midnight, and she explained that the show went out at midnight, from midnight till 1 a.m. and to do time checks, because she wanted everyone to think it was a live show. That was the whole idea of the thing. So she just would look up the clock, she'd say it's now 10 past midnight, or it's 12:25. So she started her show. The radio station, she did ask me never to mention it to anyone, Blue Moon Radio. It was Blue Moon. I'd never heard of it, of course, because not living in London, I couldn't get FM down here from London, so I'd not heard of it. She was really professional. She said to me while the records were playing, because the mic was off while they're playing so we could chat, she said that she didn't do any editing, or tried not to. She just wanted to do the hour show live. What she did, there were 2 tapes. She did a half hour on one paragraph and the other half hour on the other. She'd just flick over to the other one. And she was just so professional. I just sat there, again, in awe, watching her and listening to her. It was incredible. No mistakes. She knew her music. She knew what she was doing. It was just fantastic to watch and listen. After about 20 minutes, she said, "Oh, I know. I'll introduce you as a guest in the studio, a guest DJ." I said, no, hang on, I'm not a DJ. I said, "I know I've mucked around on my own small pirate radio stations, but I'm not a DJ. I can't do that." She said, "Of course you can. Have confidence." And I said, "No, confidence has nothing to do with it. I can't do it." She said, "You've got a good voice. You've got a radio voice." So I didn't realise that. I didn't even think I had. But she said, "Don't worry, I'll prompt you." She said, "When this record's ended, I'll prompt you, so you just follow my lead." The record ended, and I have to admit I was shaking slightly when she said, "I have in the studio with me a fellow DJ, Steve, Mr. Stone Mason." Steve, Mr. Stone Mason. I thought, what sort? Actually, it's quite good. But initially I thought, what sort of name is that? Steve, Mr. Stone Mason. I sort of got the pun, but I'm looking at her like, what are you doing? I don't like this. She didn't want to edit. She'd already told me that, so she didn't want to cut things out. She had a fantastic voice, and I know I keep saying it, but she really was professional. She looked at me and she said, "So, Steve, you've been DJing in Australia for the last 6 months, and you're now back in the UK, so what are your plans?" Of course, I looked at her. "Well, I haven't got any plans." "What plans?" My plan was to have another beer. And I just said, "Well, I've got various things lined up." And she said, "You've already told me one of your plans is to buy a place somewhere in the country where you can set up a big recording studio." And I said, "Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm looking around at properties at the moment. I've got all the gear ready to go. I just got back into the UK. I'm looking for somewhere to buy so I can set up this studio. And I want to have live bands." And I just went into one. And she's looking at me, surprised, and putting her thumb up like, yes, keep going. So anyway, she then put on another record and we had a quick chat. And she was saying, "This is brilliant. We're working together. This is brilliant. Don't stop." As the show went on, we kept having this banter in between records, and I was improving. She was leading me, she was prompting me, and I was finding it easy. With her help, I found it easy, and I was becoming more relaxed, and so obviously sounding better. And after the show, she said that she tried to work with other people in the past, and it just didn't work. She said, with us two, we just fitted together. It just worked. And I was so pleased because I loved it. I was enjoying it. I was sitting with this beautifully attractive girl, having a beer in her studio, and we're DJing together. I mean, I was in heaven. She always listened to the whole show after the show on the recording before sending the tape off. So she started it at the beginning. We sat there drinking, chatting, laughing, listening to the show, and it had worked. We both agreed it had worked. Now, she said to me, "I wonder what Karen will think." And I'm saying, "Well, okay, who's Karen?" Well, she owned the radio station. It was her pirate radio station. And she said, "Oh, the idea was that the radio station was by girls, for girls." Now, she'd never agreed with that. This is what Karen had always wanted. but Kirsty had always said we should have some sort of male element in it. And I said, well, you've got that now. What are you going to do if Karen says, what are you doing? You've ruined the show. I don't want this. She said, don't worry, there's always a couple of shows kind of in stock, ready to go if there's a problem. We listened to the hour-long show, had a couple more drinks, and I stayed there that night. By the time we were drinking, chatting, looked at the clock, it's kind of 1:30 in the morning, and she said, look, you might as well stay, which I did. I went round to her flat on Saturday morning. She said Karen had received the tapes, she'd listened to the show, and I was waiting for the response. She loved it. She wanted more. She said, right, you and I, Steve, Mr. Stone Mason, and the girl are a team. So I was amazed. I said, this is fantastic. This is what I've dreamed of all my life, actually being a professional DJ. And she said, well, there's no money in it. You don't get paid. I didn't care about the money. I just enjoyed being with Kirsty and doing our banter and our drinking and our chatting. We were just, as I said earlier, we were just so much on the same wavelength. It was uncanny. We did the show every week for several weeks. And then she said to me, I'm going up to see Karen this weekend. Do you want to come with me? So I did. Went in her car. She had a Mini, a really nice Mini. Or was it a Cooper, Mini Cooper S? Again, another expensive sort of item. She seemed to have loads of money. I couldn't find out anything about her family. I'd mentioned her parents, her brothers and sisters, and she just said, no, didn't want to really talk about it. So I just left it. We went up to London, and this Karen had a flat in Putney, a really nice flat. Again, more money, lots of money. I got on well with Karen. We chatted about the shows, and she was loving every minute of it. She was as secretive and mysterious, if not more, than Kirsty. I asked her about the station, about the transmitter. Had she ever been caught? Had she ever come close to being caught? Where did she transmit from? What was the transmitter? She was very, very well up on radio. She knew all about transmitters and audio, everything, aerials. She was talking about SWR, if you know what that is, setting up the aerial and getting the SWR right for the transmitter. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was early 20s, about the same age as Kirsty. They'd obviously known each other for a long time by the way they were chatting, and after a while I gathered that they'd been to school together, so they'd known each other for a good few years. I also gathered that, just from listening and reading between the lines, their parents knew each other, and their parents had a lot of money. Karen was talking about her father would be in severe trouble if anything went wrong and he found out what was going on, if it became public. So I was then thinking that perhaps their parents are in the public eye, because Kirsty was saying if my dad finds out, he'll lose his job. There'll be all sorts of trouble ahead for the whole family. This is why they were so secretive, which was understandable. I didn't pursue it anymore with Karen. I did mention a couple of times about the transmitter, and she said I transmit from a van. She said I drive around either Wandsworth Common, was it? She said she drives around to various places, parks the van, puts the dipole up, and she transmits. There were other shows. It wasn't just Kirsty's show. Well, it wasn't now Kirsty and me. There were other shows as well. She had other DJs, apparently, that each did an hour slot, and she'd put them out at various times. Kirsty's show was at midnight. There were others. I did drive up to London one Saturday because I wanted to hear the show. I didn't go to Karen's place, but I parked near to her flat and I listened. I tuned around and I found it. I found the radio station and I listened to Kirsty and myself doing our banter and playing the records, and it was great. I only went up there the once. I didn't tell Kirsty that, or Karen, because I didn't want to think that I'd betrayed their trust or I was poking my nose in when they'd said don't. The girl and Steve, Mr. Mason, did the shows for several weeks. I think it was about 3 months, possibly a bit more. And then Kirsty said to me out of the blue, she said, the radio station's closing down. She wouldn't tell me whether Karen had been busted or what had happened. Radio station was closing down. But worse news was she was moving to London. So that was it. That was it. I was devastated. I was in the middle of moving myself. I'd sold my place and I was in a rented flat, just waiting for everything to go through so I could go into the place I was buying. Everything was changing. It was a disaster. Radio station's gone. Kirsty's moving to London. I'm in the middle of moving. She said, don't worry, we'll keep in touch. She had my phone number. That was all right. She'd never been to my place. We'd spent basically all the time at her flat. I'd virtually moved in. And I had been hoping, I must be honest, I had been hoping that we would perhaps make something together for the future. I didn't want to move to London. She did say, why don't you come to London with me? I couldn't do that. I was buying a place down south. I had various things going on. I couldn't just up sticks and go to London. On the day she moved out, she actually told me that her father owned the house with all these converted flats, and he was selling the whole thing. And he bought her a flat in London. So there was obviously a lot of money there. She had my phone number. I saw her off. I said goodbye. And I thought that I'd be seeing her very soon. I was just waiting for her to give me a ring, to give me her phone number, because there were no mobile phones in those days. She was having a phone installed in her flat. She was going to phone me, give me her number and invite me up. I was going to go up as soon as she'd settled in. The idiot landlord where I was staying hadn't paid the phone bill and it had been cut off. So Kirsty couldn't phone me. I didn't have her address. She didn't know her address. Her father had bought her this flat. She didn't know the address. I didn't have any way of contacting her. All she had was my phone number, which had now been cut off. And that was that. I drove to London to Karen's flat. I just about remembered where it was. And she'd moved. So I didn't know what was going on there. The whole place where she was living was sold. It was a similar setup. It was a big house. And I wonder whether Kirsty's father owned that as well. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but we just had no way of contacting each other or tracing each other. I didn't know her surname. In fact, at that stage, I began to wonder whether Kirsty was her real name, because that's the name she used on the air. Now, she'd made up another name for me. She didn't call me Ray. I was Steve, Mr. Stone Mason. I never forget that as long as I live. I love that. Even now, when I think back, I'm thinking, was there anything I could have done? I just couldn't trace anyone. I didn't know Karen's other name. I didn't know anything. I moved into my new flat. I had a telephone there, but of course that was no good to anyone. Kirsty didn't know my surname. I had looked when I'd been at her flat on many, many occasions. I'd looked to see if there was any post, to see if I could see her name on there, because she was so secretive and mysterious. I just thought I might have a look. It might say Miss K whatever, Smith or whatever. But there was no post, nothing to confirm her name. Many years later, I was listening to a commercial radio station and I heard her. She was DJing. She was a professional DJ on a commercial radio station. Now, I'm 99% sure it was her. No, 100% sure. She wasn't using the name Kirsty. I'm not going to mention the name. And I'm not going to mention the radio station. I didn't contact her. I was going to contact her via the station, but this was many years later, and I decided against it for various reasons. There was stuff going on in my life, and I assumed that there was stuff going on in her life. This was a long time later, so I left it at that. We'd had our few months together, which was absolutely fantastic, and we'd both moved on. So that's the end of Kirsty the girl and Steve, Mr. Stone Mason. We were good together in every single way. Hope you've enjoyed listening to the podcast. Look out for the next one. Bye bye for now.